I'm 80 years old, and the people I gave my whole life to didn't even care if I lived or died, until they found out I was worth $10 million. My name is Arthur Rahim Carter, and for years, I lived in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Rittenhouse Square. A big house, beautiful surroundings, but inside that house, I was invisible. I had 3 sons, Kevin, Richard, and Daniel. Successful, busy, always too occupied, too busy to sit with me, too busy to ask if I'd eaten, too busy to care. My daughters-in-law saw me as a burden, and my grandchildren, they barely looked at me. To them I was just an old, poor man who told boring stories no one wanted to hear. At 80 years old, Arthur Rahim Carter still woke up every morning in a house most people would dream of living in. The tall windows let in soft sunlight. The polished wooden floors reflected a quiet elegance. And the streets outside in Rittenhouse Square carried the charm of wealth and status. Everything about the place spoke of comfort, success, and a life well lived. But for Arthur, none of it meant anything anymore. Because inside that beautiful home, he had slowly become invisible. His room was tucked away in a quiet corner of the house, far from the laughter and conversations that occasionally filled the main living areas. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when this house echoed with his voice, his decisions, his presence. He had built this life, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. But now it felt like he was just there, not seen, not heard, not needed. Days passed in silence. Arthur would sit by the window, watching people walk by, wondering how it felt to be acknowledged, to be greeted, to matter to someone. Inside the house, footsteps would pass his door, voices would rise and fall in distant rooms, but no one stopped, no one knocked. No one asked how he was doing, even at the dining table, when he occasionally gathered the strength to join the family. He felt like an outsider. Conversations would continue around him, as if he wasn't there. Plans were made, jokes were shared, decisions were discussed, but never with him, never for him. If he spoke, his words were often ignored or brushed aside, with polite nods that carried no real interest. Over time, Arthur stopped trying. He began to eat alone in his room, slowly, quietly. His meals were simple, sometimes barely touched, not because he wasn't hungry, but because eating alone had lost its meaning. He would look at the empty chair across from him and remember a time when someone used to sit there, listen to him, smile at him. Those memories felt distant now, like echoes from another life. He wore the same old clothes day after day, comfortable but worn. His glasses, slightly cracked at the edge, were something he had fixed so many times that the repairs had become part of them. But no one noticed. Or maybe they did, and just didn't care enough to say anything. In a house filled with people, Arthur lived in complete loneliness, not the kind of loneliness that comes from being physically alone, but the deeper kind, the kind where you exist in the same space as others, yet feel completely unseen. He had become part of the background, like the furniture that filled the rooms. Always there, always present, but never truly valued. Arthur had 3 sons, Kevin, Richard, and Daniel, and on paper, they were everything a father could be proud of. Kevin worked in corporate finance, always dressed sharply, always rushing from one meeting to another. Richard managed his own small business and constantly talked about expenses, bills, and responsibilities. Daniel, the youngest, was ambitious and restless, chasing opportunities and rarely staying in one place for long. From the outside, they looked like successful men building strong lives for themselves. But somewhere along the way, in the middle of all that success, they had slowly left their father behind. Their days were full, but their priorities were clear. Work came first, then their own families, their friends, their routines. Arthur didn't fit into any of that anymore. He wasn't part of their plans, their conversations, or even their daily thoughts. It wasn't that they openly rejected him. It was worse than that. They simply forgot he was there. Kevin would often walk past Arthur's room while talking lightly on his phone, discussing deals and deadlines, never once pausing to step inside. Even when Arthur tried to catch his attention, Kevin would raise a finger, signaling him to wait, and then walk away as if that moment could be postponed forever. It never came back. Richard, whenever he saw Arthur, would immediately start talking about his own problems. School fees, rising costs, business pressures. But he never asked how Arthur was doing. It was always about him, his stress, his struggles. Arthur would sit quietly, listening, nodding, offering a few gentle words. But deep down he knew those conversations were one-sided. He was not a father in those moments, just a silent listener. Daniel was the most distant of all. Sometimes days would go by without Arthur even seeing him. When he did appear, it was brief, quick greetings, distracted replies, eyes glued to his phone. Even when they sat in the same room, there was a wall between them, built not of anger, but of indifference. Family dinners, when they happened, felt hollow. The three brothers would talk among themselves, sharing updates, laughing, arguing about small things, but Arthur remained outside that circle. His presence didn't change the conversation. It didn't add or subtract anything. It was as if he had become invisible in his own family. There were moments when Arthur wanted to speak, to remind them of the years he had spent raising them, guiding them, sacrificing for them. He wanted to ask for something so simple. Just a few minutes of their time, a genuine conversation, a little attention. But every time he thought about it, he stopped himself. He didn't want to feel like he was asking for something he should have never needed to ask for in the first place. Slowly, he stopped expecting anything, and in that silence, the distance between a father and his sons grew wider with each passing day, until it felt like they were no longer living in the same home, but in completely different worlds. It wasn't just his sons who had grown distant. Arthur could feel it even more sharply in the way his daughters-in-law treated him. There was a quiet coldness in their behavior, something unspoken, but always present. They were polite when they had to be, but never warm, never genuine. Their smiles felt forced, their words carefully measured, as if kindness toward him was an obligation rather than a feeling. Over time, Arthur began to understand what he had become in their eyes. Not a respected elder, not the man who built the foundation of this family, but simply a burden they had to tolerate. He noticed it in small things. The way conversations would suddenly stop when he entered a room. The way they would exchange glances, subtle but clear, as if his presence was inconvenient. In the kitchen he was made to feel like an outsider. If he ever stepped in, even just to get a glass of water, there was always a moment of hesitation, a quiet discomfort, as if he had crossed into a space where he didn't belong. Once, he had tried to help, offering to carry something or set the table, but the response was quick and dismissive. "It's okay. You don't need to do that." After that, he stopped trying. Meals became another reminder of his place in the house. Food would be prepared and served, but no one asked what he preferred. No one checked if he had eaten enough. Sometimes his plate was left on the side, as if it were an afterthought. Other times, he would simply take whatever was available and return to his room, eating alone in silence. The dining table, once a place of connection, had turned into a space where he felt even more alone. His grandchildren followed what they saw. Children learn quickly, and they had learned that their grandfather was not someone to pay attention to. They would pass by him without greeting, their eyes fixed on their phones or lost in their own worlds. When he tried to speak to them, to share a small story, or ask about their day, their responses were short, distracted, and often ended with them walking away before he had even finished speaking. To them, he was just an old man, someone who belonged to the past, someone who had nothing to offer in the present. They didn't see the life he had lived, the struggles he had faced, the sacrifices he had made for the very family that now ignored him. They only saw what was in front of them. An aging figure in simple clothes, sitting quietly, saying little. There were moments when Arthur would watch them from a distance, hoping for something small, a smile, a greeting, even a simple acknowledgement. But those moments rarely came, and each time they didn't, something inside him grew a little quieter, a little more distant. In a house full of people, surrounded by family, Arthur found himself carrying a loneliness that felt heavier than anything he had ever known, as if he no longer had a place in the very home he once called his own. Arthur never corrected them when they assumed he had nothing left. In fact, he quietly allowed that belief to grow, because over time it became easier than explaining the truth. He dressed in the same simple, worn-out clothes day after day, soft, faded fabric that had lost its color, but not its comfort. His shoes were old but polished, his routine unchanged. To anyone looking at him, he appeared like a man who had outlived his means, someone surviving on whatever little was left after a lifetime of work. His glasses told a similar story. One side had a thin crack, barely holding together, with a careful repair he had done himself. He would adjust them gently every time they slipped down his nose, as if afraid they might finally break beyond repair. It wasn't that he couldn't afford a new pair. He simply chose not to replace them. The broken frame had become part of the image everyone already believed in, and Arthur had stopped feeling the need to challenge that image. He kept his habits simple. No expensive preferences, no demands, no signs of indulgence. When new things entered the house, furniture, decorations, gadgets, none of them were ever meant for him, and he never asked. He sat quietly in his corner, blending into the background so naturally that people stopped noticing him altogether. What his family didn't know was that this simplicity was a choice, not a necessity. Years ago, Arthur had made decisions that quietly shaped a very different reality. He had invested in land when no one else saw its value, trusted his instincts when others doubted him, and built something in silence. But he never spoke about it. He never felt the need to prove anything to anyone, especially not to those who never bothered to ask. Over time, their assumptions about him became stronger. They spoke around him as if money was always a problem, as if he couldn't possibly contribute or understand. Sometimes he overheard small comments about expenses, about how difficult things were, and there was always an unspoken conclusion that Arthur was someone who could offer nothing. It didn't hurt the way it used to. Instead, it revealed something deeper about how they measured worth. In their eyes, value had a price. Respect came with visible success. And since Arthur showed neither, he received neither. There were moments when he could have changed everything with a single sentence. A simple truth. He could have revealed what he had built, what he still owned, what he was truly worth. But each time that thought crossed his mind, he pushed it away, because something inside him wanted to see, to understand, to be sure, was their treatment of him really based on who he was, or just on what they believed he had? So he stayed quiet. And in that silence, the illusion of his poverty grew stronger, shaping the way everyone saw him, judged him, and ultimately ignored him. It began with a heaviness in his chest, the kind that didn't go away with rest. Arthur tried to ignore it at first, telling himself it was just another sign of age, another passing discomfort that would fade by morning. But the days that followed only made it worse. His breathing grew uneven, his steps slower, and even the short walk from his bed to the window began to feel like a challenge. Still, no one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't think it mattered enough to ask. One afternoon, the pain became sharper, more urgent. Arthur sat on the edge of his bed, holding his chest, waiting for the feeling to pass. Minutes stretched longer than they should have. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to fear. Not just fear of the pain, but of what it meant to be in that moment, completely alone. He reached for his phone and called Kevin. The call connected after a few rings. Arthur tried to keep his voice steady as he explained he wasn't feeling well, that he might need to go to the hospital. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a familiar response. Quick, distracted, distant. Kevin said. He was in the middle of an important meeting and couldn't leave. He told Arthur to call Richard instead. Arthur ended the call quietly and dialed Richard's number. This time, the response came with a sigh. Richard sounded stressed, already overwhelmed. Before Arthur could fully explain his condition, Richard started talking about expenses, about how tight things were, about responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. Then came the suggestion, call Daniel. Arthur hesitated for a moment before dialing the last number. The phone rang and eventually went unanswered. He lowered the phone slowly, staring at the screen as it went dark. In that silence, something inside him shifted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was a quiet realization, settling deeply into his heart, that when he truly needed someone, there was no one to come. With effort, he stood up, steadying himself against the wall. Each step toward the door felt heavier than the last, but he kept moving. There was no one to lean on, no one to wait for. He picked up his coat, his old bag, and walked out of the house without saying a word to anyone. Outside, the world moved as it always did. Cars passing, people walking, life continuing without pause. Arthur raised his hand and stopped a taxi, his movement slow but determined. The driver glanced at him through the mirror, perhaps noticing something in his expression, but said nothing. As the car moved through the streets, Arthur leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. The city around him felt distant, almost unreal. All he could feel was the quiet weight of the moment, the understanding that even in a house full of family, he had reached a point where he had to take himself to the hospital, alone, because there was simply no one willing to stand beside him. The hospital visit changed something in Arthur, not just physically, but deep within his mind. Sitting alone in that quiet room, listening to the distant sounds of machines and footsteps in the hallway, he had more time than ever to think. No interruptions, no distractions, just silence and truth. For years he had been patient. He had excused their behavior, told himself they were busy, that life had changed, that this was just how things were now. But that day, lying there with no one beside him, he finally saw things clearly. It wasn't that they were busy. It was that he was no longer important to them. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with a strange sense of calm, a kind of clarity that only appears when there is nothing left to hold onto. Arthur understood that he had been waiting for attention, for care, for even the smallest sign that he still mattered. And in that waiting, he had allowed himself to be slowly erased from their lives. But now, something inside him refused to wait any longer. When he returned home, nothing had changed. The same routines, the same distant voices, the same lack of concern. No one asked where he had been. No one noticed what he had gone through. It was as if his absence had meant nothing at all. That was the moment his decision became final. Arthur didn't rush. He didn't argue. He didn't confront anyone. Instead, he chose a different path, quiet, controlled, and certain. He reached out to his lawyer, someone he had trusted for many years, someone who knew parts of his life that even his family didn't. Over a calm and deliberate conversation, Arthur explained everything he wanted to do. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt in his mind. The lawyer listened carefully, understanding the weight of the decision being made. Once everything was arranged, Arthur asked for one more thing, to gather the entire family in the living room. It wasn't a request they were used to hearing from him. Usually, he stayed out of their way, never asking for attention. So when the message reached them, it created a sense of mild curiosity, mixed with irritation. They came, one by one, carrying their usual expressions. Kevin checked his watch more than once, clearly pressed for time. Richard looked distracted, his mind somewhere else. Daniel leaned back casually, as if expecting something unimportant. The daughters-in-law sat together, whispering quietly, while the grandchildren hovered nearby without much interest. Arthur entered the room slowly, leaning on his cane, his face calm but firm. For once, all eyes were on him. But it wasn't concern that filled the room. It was impatience. No one asked if he was okay. No one mentioned his recent illness. No one even wondered why he had called them all together. To them, it felt like just another interruption in their busy lives. Arthur looked at each of them carefully, taking in their faces, their expressions, their distance. And in that moment, he knew he had made the right decision, a decision that would finally break the silence he had lived in for so long. Arthur didn't rush the moment. He walked slowly toward the center table and placed the file down with steady hands. The soft sound it made against the wood seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the quiet room. Everyone's eyes shifted toward it, curiosity replacing some of their impatience. For them, it was just another document, something routine, something ordinary. But for Arthur, it carried decades of decisions, sacrifices, and silence. Daniel leaned forward first, a faint smirk on his face. "So, Dad, what is this?" "Finally decided to divide whatever you have left." His tone carried a mix of sarcasm and amusement, as if he already knew the answer. Arthur didn't respond. Instead, he slowly opened the file. Inside were neatly arranged documents, each page telling a story no one in that room had ever cared to hear. Property papers, legal records, financial statements, all organized with quiet precision. Arthur gently turned the first page and pushed the file slightly forward so they could see. Kevin's expression changed first. His eyes narrowed, focusing more carefully. Richard leaned in next, his casual posture suddenly gone. Daniel's smirk began to fade as he flipped through a few pages, his movements growing slower with each one. "What is this?" Richard murmured, almost to himself. Arthur remained silent, letting the documents speak. The papers revealed land purchased decades ago, large portions of property on the outskirts of the city, bought at a time when no one saw their value. Over the years, that land had transformed into a thriving residential development, now worth more than anyone in that room had imagined. Alongside it were detailed records of investments, shares in multiple companies, accounts that had grown steadily, quietly, without attention. Page after page the truth unfolded, and then they saw the total, over $10 million. The air in the room changed instantly. The same people who had barely looked at Arthur minutes ago were now staring at him, as if seeing him for the first time. Kevin straightened his posture, his voice suddenly softer, more controlled. Richard quickly put his phone away, his full attention now fixed on Arthur. Daniel, who had been the most dismissive, now looked completely stunned, flipping back through the papers as if hoping he had misunderstood something. The daughters-in-law exchanged quick glances, their earlier whispers replaced by silence filled with calculation. Even the grandchildren, sensing the shift, moved closer. Their curiosity suddenly awakened, and then, just as quickly as the silence had settled, it broke. Richard stood up and moved toward Arthur, his tone completely changed. "Why didn't you tell us? We had no idea." His voice carried a mix of surprise and urgency. Kevin stepped forward next, his earlier impatience gone. "You should have said something. We could have helped you manage all this." Daniel closed the file slowly, his expression no longer mocking, but careful, almost respectful. This is incredible, Dad." Arthur watched them all without interrupting. Their words had changed. Their faces had changed. But something deeper had not. And standing there, he could see it clearly now, the sudden attention, the softened voices, the forced concern. It wasn't him they were reacting to. It was what he had revealed, and for the first time, there was no doubt left in his mind about what truly mattered to them. Arthur let the silence stretch for a few moments longer, allowing their reactions to settle into the room. He could see it clearly now, the shift in their posture, the sudden warmth in their voices, the urgency in their eyes. Just minutes ago, he had been an interruption in their day. Now, he had become the center of their attention. But it wasn't him they had finally seen. It was the number on those pages. He adjusted his grip on the cane and took a slow breath, steadying himself. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but firm enough to cut through every lingering whisper. "You're not looking at me," he said quietly. "You're looking at this file." No one interrupted him this time. I have lived in this house for 80 years, he continued, his eyes moving from one face to another. And not once did any of you ask if I had eaten. Not once did you sit with me when I was alone. You were all here, but I was always by myself. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything they had expected. Kevin lowered his gaze. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Daniel remained still, his expression unreadable. The daughters-in-law said nothing, their earlier confidence gone. Even the grandchildren stood quietly, unsure of what to do. You thought I had nothing, Arthur said. His voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. And because of that, you decided I was worth nothing. There was no anger in his tone, just truth. He turned slightly toward his lawyer, who had been standing quietly to the side, waiting. With a small nod, Arthur gave him the signal. I have already made my decision, Arthur said. Everything you see in this file, every dollar, has been transferred into a trust. That caught their attention again, but this time it was different. Confusion replaced certainty. A trust? Daniel asked, his voice tense. Arthur nodded. A trust that takes care of abandoned elderly people. People who have no one. People who are left alone, just like I was. The room went still again. Kevin stepped forward slightly, as if trying to say something, but no words came out. Richard looked down at the floor, his face tight with realization. Daniel's grip on the file loosened, and it slipped shut in his hands. I am leaving this house, Arthur continued. I will be moving to a retirement home. At least there, I will be treated with dignity. At least there, I will not feel invisible. This time no one tried to stop him. There were no arguments, no excuses, no sudden promises that could change what had already been revealed. Arthur bent down slowly, picking up his old bag, the same one he had carried for years, unnoticed, unimportant. He straightened himself with effort, holding onto his cane, and took a final look around the room. These were the people he had built his life for. And yet, they felt like strangers. Without another word, he turned toward the door. Each step was slow, but certain. No one followed. No one called out. And as he reached the door, he didn't hesitate. He didn't look back, because there was nothing left behind worth returning to. As he stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter, freer. The world beyond that house no longer felt distant or unreachable. For the first time in years, Arthur felt in control of his own life, not defined by neglect, not measured by others' indifference. He walked forward, leaving behind the silence, the regret, and the truth they had all finally been forced to face. And in that quiet moment, with nothing but the road ahead, he carried something far more valuable than wealth, a sense of peace. He had been denied for far too long. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so you never miss powerful stories like this. Your support means everything.